You're listening to the Neurocareers podcast with Dr. K. Episode number 13. Dear Neurocareer podcast listeners, I'm thrilled to introduce our today's podcast guest, Dr. Anthony Barnhart. Dr. Barnhart is a cognitive psychologist who is studying the science of magic. I think it's absolutely amazing area of research, and even more amazing, Dr. Barnhart's path to his current career, because he started it from being a professional magician. Welcome, Dr. Barnhart. Thank you so much for joining us. It's a great pleasure to have you in our podcast. Can you please share where are you talking to us from and introduce yourself? Thank you so much.
Well, hello. Thank you for having me. I'm speaking to you today from Carthage College in Kenosha, Wisconsin, right on Lake Michigan. If I had a window office, I'd be able to see that lake. Yeah, you're correct. I'm a cognitive psychologist. I've been at Carthage College for 7 years now, and while I was a graduate student studying language, I started seeing researchers publishing work that took its inspiration from performance magic, or that used the tools of magicians in the laboratory to test hypotheses about attention and perception. And I thought, there's nothing special about me to study language, right? I don't have any leg up on any other individual. I can read the literature just like anybody else and come up with some hypotheses. But as you mentioned, I was a professional magician in a past life. And so I have all of this training in magic that really could give me a leg up in this kind of new research program on the science of magic. So I was lucky enough to have a graduate mentor who was a Renaissance man, who was willing to let me explore new, unique areas and to come along for the ride. And so I shifted focus and I started studying attention through the lens of performance magic, both testing untested hypotheses that magicians have developed and using magic as a research tool in the laboratory. And it's been very successful for me. I don't think I would have this job if I hadn't shifted focus at that point in time. And it's this movement to use magic in the laboratory is really gaining momentum. We now have an organization, the Science of Magic Association, and we just had our third biennial conference in London last month. So there's broad interest in this research topic, and I hope that I can continue to bring new researchers and magicians into the fold to pursue this topic area.
I think it's so important to have mentors who really can support your curiosity, your interest. Our previous guest, Professor Chipka from Queen Mary, University of London, was talking about students being curious and doing what they really want to do. And then they can allocate their energy, their resources to something they love and achieve amazing results. So I think you are a beautiful example of that.
As I tell my students on the first day of every class, it's my hope that I'll be able to write them a letter of recommendation someday, but they need to give me the materials to allow me to write that letter. And one of the positive dog whistles that I would love to be able to include in every letter of recommendation is highlighting their intellectual curiosity. I want to be able to use those words because those words send a message to the readers, whether they be employers or people on a committee evaluating graduate applicants. Intellectual curiosity is a really important part of the recipe for success in graduate school and in many different careers.
That's very interesting that you are talking about intellectual curiosity, because I think that the science of magic and in general magic as a profession evokes that curiosity. And in one of your YouTube videos, I saw your discussion about the AWE.
Yes, AWE, awe, yep.
And you are talking about is as a wonder and also curiosity. Can you tell more about that? And do you see how this science of magic that you are talking about and researching in your laboratory help students actually to develop that curiosity?
Sure. I think one of my great successes has been my implementation of magic in the classroom. I use magic not infrequently. I use it in my research methods course to get students developing hypotheses to explain phenomena that they've witnessed. And I've used it in sensation and perception courses to teach like sort of real world examples of where these tendencies of our perceptual systems can be hacked. And I think people who study wonder and people who study awe often talk about the experience of wonder starting with this mismatch between your expectations about the world and what you're witnessing, what your senses are bringing to you. And the consequence, usually, of experiencing wonder is exploration, is curiosity, is trying to seek out explanations for what you've witnessed. And certainly in neuroscience and in psychology, that's our job, as far as I'm concerned, to find natural explanations for these unusual quirks of the human mind. So I think magic is a powerful tool for eliciting curiosity, maybe more importantly, eliciting wonder, which brings about this positive experience that then leads into a need for exploration or a drive for exploration. I think it's no coincidence that I became a psychologist after I became a magician. I think this is actually a path that many magicians find themselves on. I just went a little further than many others do. Magic brings about both kind of a materialist worldview, right? Like you realize how easily duped our senses are and how many of these seemingly paranormal experiences actually have natural origins that can be explained. And so many magicians read psychology literature. They're curious about the mind because they have these firsthand experiences with the fallibility of perception and cognition. And so it drives many magicians towards psychology. And I think it can be a useful tool also for driving undergraduate psychology students toward the science of psychology. I don't know how it works in neuroscience, but the average undergraduate psychology major thinks they're going to be a clinical psychologist who's like helping people deal with their mental illnesses. And that's true for a rather small proportion of students, right? Like clinical psychology graduate programs are the most competitive graduate programs out there. The average student just doesn't have the academic chops to make it there. And so magic can inspire an interest in experimental psychology. It can both present students with something that is intrinsically interesting, that captures their curiosity, and it can be a segue into the kind of thinking that experimentalists engage in. It can be a segue into teaching the scientific process. And I've brought all sorts of students into my lab through that pathway of inspiring curiosity with magic and then using it as a teaching tool to get them excited about the science of psychology. And it's those scientific tools that are the marketable tools for every undergraduate psychology student. They just don't know it yet, right? Those are the tools that they're going to be able to put to work in almost any job that they take, and definitely is the best pathway towards graduate school.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. The science of magic, it's fairly new area of study, although the roots are going far into the past.
That's right.
Can you define or briefly explain what is the science of magic and maybe just a brief history tour into the past of how did it develop?
Sure. Well, how about I tell you that history, and I think you'll have a better sense of what the science of magic is about through this historical lens. So, for me, the story of the science of magic begins in the last decade of the 1800s, when a bunch of different prolific psychologists started exploring the techniques of magicians. And in just that last decade of the 1800s, there were 4 or 5 scientific papers published exploring the methods of magicians. And these were published by real movers and shakers in the field. People like Joseph Jastrow, who we know as the founder of the famous psychology program at the University of Wisconsin, but who was a prolific vision scientist. A lot of illusions that still show up in sensation and perception classes were developed by Joseph Jastrow or popularized by Joseph Jastrow. People like Alfred Binet, who we know primarily for his work in intelligence testing. He wrote this enormous treatise on the psychology of magic in 1894 and is credited with capturing the first moving pictures of a performing magician in service of the research that he was doing. Norman Triplett, who is known widely as the first person to carry out an experiment in social psychology, well, he did his dissertation on the psychology of magic. And so what was happening in this one decade that led to an explosion in interest in the methods of magicians? Well, there were a lot of what I would label kooky beliefs in the United States and abroad in the mid 1800s. Things like mesmerism were becoming quite popular throughout the United States. This notion that we have these mysterious energies flowing through our bodies. Mesmer called it animal magnetism. And he believed that all mental illness, all disorders of all kinds are the result of an imbalance in these mysterious energies. And through the laying on of hands, he could redistribute those energies and fix everybody's problems. Well, while people were mesmerized, they claimed to have all of these unusual experiences. They communed with the angels, or they traveled to different places and times. They talked to ghosts. Well, this was making its way to the United States in the mid-1800s. And meanwhile, in New York, a religion known as spiritualism was being founded, which is still alive and well today in all of the pseudopsychics who claim they can talk to spirits. The Fox sisters, just a couple of teenage girls in New York, started claiming that they were having conversations with the ghost of a peddler who'd been murdered and buried in their cellar. They could ask questions of the spirits, and the spirit would respond with these loud rapping noises. 1 rap for yes, 2 raps for no. And they took the show on the road. They traveled all around the United States doing seances, having people in the audience ask questions that would be answered by the spirits with these rapping noises. Well, in something like 1880, the American Society for Psychical Research was founded, and the founding members of this group realized that we need to get to the bottom of what's going on with these mesmerists and with these psychics. Like, if they can actually talk to the dead, that's pretty good information to have, right? Like, it would be good to be able to evaluate the reality of what they seem to be demonstrating. Well, it's my position that these psychics were using the methods of magicians, even though they won't acknowledge it. That's not quite true. One of the Fox sisters did later come clean and acknowledge that they were making these rapping noises through a variety of natural means, one including this strange rigging of an apple on the end of a string that was attached to their foot or something. But most grotesquely, they learned to crack the knuckles in their toes very loudly, and it created this sort of ethereal rapping noise that you couldn't localize. They were using natural means to produce what seemed to be supernatural effects. Well, these scientists in 1880 created this organization to get to the bottom of this. And some of the founders of this group were names like G. Stanley Hall, who's a rather famous psychologist. He was Norman Triplett's graduate advisor. And Joseph Jastrow was one of the founding members of this group. Well, after about a decade, many of these founding members had jumped ship on the organization because it had become something other than what they had envisioned. Rather than trying to use science to evaluate reality, it seemed that many members of this group were more interested in trying to find evidence to support their beliefs about the world. And that's not really what science is about. Some of these folks sort of left the group and they turned their attention to magicians. These psychics not likely to be open with the scientists, right? Like if they are using deceptive techniques, they're not going to be honest about it. It's going to cut into their bottom line. It's not going to be good for business. Magicians, on the other hand, probably have some insights into the techniques that these psychics may be using, and they're going to be more forthright with scientists because, as Jamie Ian Swiss has said, magicians are honest liars. They say they're going to lie to you, and then they do. And so I believe that all of these psychologists wrote these papers in this one decade of the 1800s because of the insights that they gave us on explaining how people can be duped by pseudopsychics. The techniques that magicians use highlight the chinks in our cognitive armor, some of these psychological tendencies that can be potentially exploited by pseudopsychics. So that was the entry point to the scientific study of magic. But in the 1900s, there was this famous revolution in psychology, the behaviorist revolution, that was all about focusing our studies only on those behaviors that are directly observable and measurable. Well, this magic stuff, it was really the stuff of thought, right? It was covert cognitive processes that at that time couldn't be measured directly. And so the science of magic sort of fell to the wayside. It was one of those research topics that didn't fit nicely within the domains of behaviorism. So it was dead for about, 80 years or something, maybe 90 years, until folks like Gustav Kuhn over in the UK, cognitive psychologist, once again started exploring the methods of magicians, bringing those methods into the laboratory. And so I think the value of the science of magic is that it allows us to mine psychological insights from a group of people who have been neglected by science for most of our existence, right? Magicians are informal cognitive scientists. They have to have hypotheses about how the mind works in order to develop techniques to deceive those minds. And magicians have a great head start on psychologists, right? Like magic has been around for millennia, and psychology has been around for, 150 years if we're generous. So they have a jump start on us. And I think we as scientists can benefit greatly by exploring some of their notions about how the mind works. Some of this folk psychology can speed up our rate of scientific discovery and can probably be integrated rather well with formal psychological models. So if I had to articulate what the science of magic is about, that would be it for me. But I think the organization, the Science of Magic Association, sees the science of magic as a broad umbrella that isn't just focused on psychology, that explores the information that magic can bring to a variety of different scientific disciplines. For example, magicians are usually 10 years ahead of the public when it comes to emerging technologies, right? Magicians have to know what the cutting edge technologies are so they can use them in their magic and deceive people. And once the public understands those, then the magicians have to adapt. One of the magician who really had the greatest impact on the form that magic takes today is a fellow named Jean-Eugène Robert Houdin, French magician. And he was also an engineer in many ways. He used electromagnetism in his magic before the public had any idea what electromagnetism was. He was a watchmaker and a clockmaker. He had this intense understanding of technology that shaped the way that he approached magic. And that has certainly fed forward into how magicians approach magic today. So that was a circuitous path to answer your question. I hope it did. But people should check out the Science of Magic Association for more information on this broad umbrella of the science of magic.
Absolutely. And we will add that link to our podcast notes so people can look at it.
Great.
You mentioned psychological vulnerabilities that are being exploited by magicians. Can you tell more about those? What are those vulnerabilities?
Sure. Since your podcast is a neuroscience podcast, primarily, let me talk about some of my research that maybe touches most closely on some of the work that neuroscientists are doing. Early on in my exploration of the science of magic, I focused on attention, and I still do focus on attention. But one of my goals was to find a research program that could both benefit science and magic, where the things that I was learning could potentially feed back to magicians and impact their performance choices. And both magicians and scientists have really great understanding of how attention operates in space. And in fact, both groups use the spotlight metaphor of attention, like attention being a spotlight that you move about your environment. So I did some early work in spatial attention, but it seemed like it wouldn't have legs because both groups know a lot about spatial attention. So I started looking at areas where both groups have limited information. And one aspect of attention that's been neglected by scientists is how attention operates in time. So we've learned that perhaps the spotlight metaphor of attention is woefully incomplete because it neglects how attention may fluctuate over time. And neuroscientists, primarily EEG researchers, have really highlighted the relationships, the correlates of these brain waves and attention. And these brain waves are constantly in flux, and those changes over time have a strong correspondence to attentional focus in time. Well, magicians have some sensitivity to how attention fluctuates over time, but their knowledge is incomplete, just as is scientists. So I started looking to what magicians call offbeats. They have these techniques that they think they can use to basically press the pause button on attention for just a moment. And there are a variety of techniques that they use. Some of them are like humor, right? They have this intuition that the moment an audience understands a joke, they're briefly blinded to the world. Their attention is turned off for just this brief moment. I actually think it's not turned off. It's focused inward toward working memory, but that's a topic for another day. Another technique is using a climax in magic to press the pause button on attention. As soon as people experience something impossible, they seem again to briefly turn off attention. Again, I think focusing inward to try to work out how we got to this place. But most pertinent to what we're talking about right now, magicians use rhythms to impact attention in time. So they use music and rhythmic speech to create moments of heightened and reduced attentional focus. And it's these rhythms that make the most contact with some of what neuroscientists have been studying. It turns out, as I'm speaking to you right now, there's a clear rhythmic structure to my speech. And your brain waves are trying to align themselves with this rhythm in the outside world, thus focusing attention at moments when there's the most useful information to extract from the world. Your brain waves are aligning themselves. They're in training to the syllables of my speech, because it's in the middle of these syllables that the most useful information is happening. And in between those moments, it's adaptive to be relaxing, right? Like you have to have some time to rebound. And so by using rhythmic speech and music, magicians can encourage the audience to be attending at certain moments in time and relaxing attention at other moments in time. And most of the time when they're doing this, they're doing it across sensory systems. They're using auditory rhythms to influence visual awareness. Well, this kind of cross-sensory attentional deployment hasn't really been studied by psychologists or neuroscientists. And so I was among the first to explore the impact that the mere presence of an auditory rhythm would have on visual awareness. So this is a place where I took inspiration from the techniques of performing magicians, but then created a rather artificial laboratory technique to tap in most directly to those variables that seemed important. So here's what we did. Participants hated it. They were monitoring a computer screen that was filled with colored noise. Every pixel of the screen was a random color. And they were monitoring this screen for the onset of a very subtle little yellowish dot that could appear anywhere. And this yellowish dot was also colored noise. It was just a little bit more yellowish than the rest of the colored noise. So a very difficult visual task. Meanwhile, they were exposed through headphones to an auditory rhythm, a tone that was played at a regular clip, a regular frequency. And we manipulated the onset of this visual event relative to the auditory stimulus. It could appear with the tone on the beat, or it could be shifted out of phase with this rhythm. And we found that regardless of whether people had to attend to the auditory rhythm, their detection of the dot was impacted by its relationship with the rhythm. If the dot appeared on the beat, they detected the dot faster and more accurately than if it was shifted off of the beat. So this came straight from magic, intuitions about how magicians can impact when attention is deployed. We tested it using sort of traditional techniques from psychology, and this sort of cross-modal, cross-sensory nature of attention and time can inform future study of how attention functions, what those mechanisms of attention are. So this is how I see the science of magic progressing most effectively. We can take ideas from magic, we can test them using our tools, we can integrate them with formal psychological theories. And the goal in the long run is to go the other direction too, to learn some more about perhaps what are the optimal rhythms for this kind of entrainment so that magicians can then make their deceptions even more effective.
Thank you very much. And actually, that was my next question. We have an explosion of interest in the science of magic in the recent years. And with the discovery of different theories behind the magic, do you see this implementation of those theories and understanding in the work of the magicians?
Yeah, so I think it's too early for magic to be benefiting a lot from the science that we're doing. Right, they have this huge head start on us. They know a lot more about the psychology of what they're doing than we do. But there are some early glimmers of instances where the science is feeding back into magic. There's a really prolific creator of magic and performer of magic in Sweden named Tom Stone, who is really among the first to do a deep dive into the work that scientists are doing in these areas and to reformulate his magic performances to learn from these techniques. And he's done a lot of writing now about how his magic has adapted to be enhanced through exploration of these scientific techniques. So perhaps his greatest influences from science have been in some of the work that we've been doing on attention, spatial attention. He has been adopting some techniques to make his deceptive actions less noticeable by the audience through implementing some of what psychologists have been studying. But perhaps the greatest impact has been through the scientific study of change blindness, which is probably covered in a lot of sensation and perception courses, both in neuroscience and psychology. This is our tendency to miss changes in the world that our attention isn't focused on. It's a little bit like inattentional blindness, but instead it seems to be driven by limitations in memory, the relationship between attention and memory. Well, here's an example from early work of Dan Simons and Chris Chabris. They would have people come into the lab, and unbeknownst to participants, the experiment was starting like the moment they walked into the lab. They would check in at a desk with this individual, they'd sign consent forms and things like that. At some moment, the person behind the desk would duck down to pick something up off the ground. And when they came up, it would be a completely different person. Completely different person. This big change that you would expect these naive individuals to detect. People almost never detected this change. They would just continue onward with this interaction with the person behind the desk, none the wiser that this change had taken place. And in order to not fall prey to change blindness, you have to both be attending to like the features of the thing that may change in the future, the person behind the desk, and you have to be accurately encoding those details into memory so that after a change takes place, you can compare what you're seeing to what you saw before. It's this complicated interaction between attention and memory. And when scientists started publishing about this, magicians started realizing that they have been exploiting change blindness for a very long time. But some folks like Tom Stone and even Penn and Teller started creating magic in their shows that solely took its inspiration from change blindness, from these extreme changes that can go unnoticed. There's a famous piece by Penn and famous to me, probably not famous to the public at this point, but a famous Penn and Teller piece where they bring someone on stage from the audience and the audience members given a camera and their job is to videotape what they're experiencing on stage. And the camera feed is being projected to the audience. The whole audience sees what's going through the camera. Well, anytime the camera is on one thing, all sorts of changes are taking place elsewhere that the audience is seeing, but the person looking through the camera lens isn't seeing. And it's one of these odd magic tricks where the entire audience is in on the magic trick except for the one person on stage. And so the audience is sort of living vicariously through the weird experience of this one person on stage. But totally took its inspiration from scientific research. Wouldn't have come about if not for the work that was being done by cognitive scientists and neuroscientists in the area of change blindness. So there are early glimmers of science feeding back into magic, but we need more work before the magicians are really going to be able to benefit from the things we're doing.
How do you see the future of the science of magic and benefit that magicians can have from the results of the research people do, maybe 20, 50 years from now?
So I think one of our long-term goals is to have more magician buy-in to the science of magic, right? We have great buy-in from prolific magicians. Our keynote speakers at the last 3 conferences have been some of the biggest names in magic, but there is some resistance from magicians who fear that what the science of magic doing could lead to all manner of exposure of secrets. And that certainly is not what the science of magic is up to. We are looking rather abstractly at magic for some of these principles that can be studied, and we aren't really in the business of sharing secrets. So I think a long-term goal is to bring more magicians into the fold so that we can better collaborate on this work. How do I see magicians benefiting from this in the long run? I think there is a great danger in magicians getting superstitious about the techniques that they use. So magicians talk about subtleties, like small things the magicians can do that will help the deception, that can all be like combined together to enhance the deception. So if the audience pictures a piece of sleight of hand known as the French drop, where let's imagine I have a coin in one hand, I take the coin with my other hand, but I'm really only pretending to transfer that coin. It really stays behind in the first hand. Well, there are all sorts of subtleties that magicians can add to that deception that they believe makes it stronger. So, like actually transferring the tension with the presumed location of the coin, having your hand be extra tense to convince the audience that it's there, like focusing on where the magician is looking, having the magician's gaze follow the presumed location of the coin, having their posture telegraph the location of the coin. There are all of these subtleties, like hundreds, arguably, of subtleties that magicians could and do use to try to heighten their deceptions. But magicians are almost never in a position to test those subtleties independently of each other, right? The only real way to evaluate whether a subtlety has an impact is through kind of reductionism, right? To try to have conditions with and without that subtlety, everything else being equal. Magicians can't really do that in the real world, right? Like we don't have like the cognitive ability to control all of these things independently of each other and to program these motor codes so that they're truly independent. But science has the tools to do that, right? So I think one of the places where science can have an immediate impact and a strong long-term impact on magic is through testing these subtleties, using our powerful techniques and thereby enhancing the methods of magicians so that they aren't getting superstitious, assuming that every added subtlety has an added benefit. When really you could be throwing a subtlety in there that harms your deception and you would be none the wiser because you can't test it out in the real world.
You basically are trying to eliminate unnecessary work that they're doing.
That's right. Unnecessary and arguably impossible work, right?
And you already mentioned the use of the technology by magicians, which dates back to early 1800s. My question is, how do you see the future implementation of the technology and maybe even neurotechnology? Now it's a very hot topic in general, and the use of AI in the technology implementation. What is your vision of how this can be potentially used in the future by magicians?
Well, I mean, magicians are currently using technologies that the public isn't fully aware of. And I'd get blackballed if I shared too many of those secrets with you. But I will say, like you invoked AI, there are scientists who are developing AI to create new magic, right? AI is not going to get stuck in the same creative ruts that magicians might get stuck in. And so there's certainly a lot of stupid things that AI will create, but there are also some deeply insightful techniques that are the result of AI analysis of magic. And I would direct your listeners to my friend Jeanette Andrews, who calls herself a sensory illusionist. She just wrapped up an art installation in New York that was all about this topic of what artificial intelligence can bring to magic. I wasn't able to make it to her installation, but my understanding is that she had artificial intelligence generating magical effects, and she was implementing these magic effects sort of on the fly. So the art installation went from conception to implementation with this artificial intelligence generated magic techniques. But she's a great person to look out for and a delightful performer and a deep thinker about the science behind what she does. Certainly, there have been many advances in wireless information transfer that have shaped current magic performance and mentalism. Mentalists are magicians who feign psychic abilities, right? And so you could imagine how wireless information transfer technologies could be hugely beneficial to a person who is claiming to be able to extract information from the mind of another person. I am probably not as deeply integrated in this cutting edge technology as many magicians are. So I can't say where that's headed because it's not my focus. I also know that there are a number of Luddites who don't trust these technologies for their performances because if the technology fails on the fly, it's hard to rebound from that in a performance. So there are many magicians who are still kind of resistant to some of these newfangled technologies because they are not guaranteed to work.
Especially new technologies, one should be careful when using those.
That's right. And the magician's goal is to make these technologies entirely invisible, right? So if the magician does it right, they'll be using advanced technologies, but it'll look like there's no technology involved to the viewer. So when Jean-Eugène Robert-Houdin used electromagnetism, it was in wooden boxes, things that looked not metallic, where magnetism could have no role, right? So the goal is to take these technologies and make them look stupid, make them look like totally invisible, to rule out technology as a method in the audience's mind.
You mentioned several times the Science of Magic Association.
Yes, the Science of Magic Association. Yes. Yep.
And the third conference, which took place in London in July of this year. And
Yes.
you presented also at that conference.
That's right.
I'm very curious, and I'm sure our listeners also are curious, what can be presented at the Science of Magic conference. Maybe you can give us just a brief summary or just brief example of that. And also, what did you present at that conference?
Sure. So we welcome magicians, scientists, humanists of all kinds who have an interest in the nature, function, and underlying mechanisms of magic. So the talks themselves are quite diverse. I'll give you just a sampling of this diversity. And in fact, our talks this year were the most diverse we've ever had. We had one psychologist who wasn't talking about laboratory research or even really qualitative research. He did an autoethnography of his own learning as a novice magician. He was a scientist who became interested in magic and decided he'd want to learn some magic, and he tried to document the process he went through to learn magic. That was more of a sociological approach to the science of magic. We had some neuroscientists and cognitive scientists who were talking about their implementation of magic in research on people's beliefs about what technology is and isn't capable of, right? Whereas people don't have a full realization of where technology is at, but they also overestimate where technology is at. Like we see this in artificial intelligence all the time. Like having this assumption that artificial intelligence will fix all of these problems when it's really just regression, right? We've been doing regression for 100 years, and this is just a fancy form of regression. Well, they used magic to convince participants that they developed a computer-based algorithm that could read facial cues and detect lies. This didn't speak directly to the techniques of magic, but it showed a way that magic can be used to test new hypotheses. Let's see, what else did we see? Well, so we always have keynote speakers from both magic and from science. And our goal with those keynote speakers is to bring a perspective to the group that is perhaps foreign, that isn't directly related to magic, but is tangentially related to magic. So one of our keynote speakers this year was Professor Sophie Scott from University College London, who is a prolific laughter researcher. And you can imagine that having some insights about what's going on with laughter and why people laugh and what elicits laughter and what laughter means can inform magic techniques, right? Like an audience's default response to witnessing magic is often laughter, even if what's being presented isn't humorous. So there's something interesting there. We had her. I hosted the conference in 2019, and we had one of our keynote speakers was Elizabeth Loftus, who's famous for her work in the fallibility of memory, which certainly she's never used magic in the laboratory. She's maybe never even thought much about magic, but it has clear implications for what magicians are doing. We also had Dan Simons, who studies inattentional blindness and who's famous for his invisible gorilla demonstration. Again, not magic, but speaks directly to it. So those are our goals with these conferences, to bring diverse, current research of all flavors and to sort of find untapped areas of research. Untapped research that can speak in some way to magic, to inspire curiosity in both these performers and these scientists.
You were listening to the first part of the podcast with Dr. Anthony Barnhart. Stay tuned for an amazing second part of this podcast.